Working? Okay, all working. So, good morning for everybody. I'm Carlos Teixeira. I'm a faculty member here at the Institute of Design. I'm also the director of the PhD program. Also a very proud graduate from the PhD program 20 years ago. So this year is completed in 20 years. And I'm glad to be here to keep the tradition going on and graduating now more students through our PhD program. Today we're going to have the oral defense of Jessica Meharry, and she will be doing the oral defense of her PhD work. Just to put context into that, the PhD program has, in the final round of their work, they have to write a dissertation. So that's a single author document that they present all the research and findings that they have done. And they also have to do an oral defense of their presentation. And that's open to the public. The reason why this is open to the public is because the PhD is a contribution to knowledge to society. So it's open because it's something that it's part of the research that develops new knowledge and give a contribution to society that can use that. So that's why we have the public defense PhD dissertations also. They become available in libraries and people can get access to them. So that's what we have here today. We're going to have about 45 minutes to 1 hour, including presentation and then question and answers. And then we're going to go with Jessica. When I say we, the committee is going to go with Jessica and have a debate and a discussion and evaluation of her work, and then define the final grade for her whole PhD. The committee is formed by me as the primary advisor. We also have, you can see here on the board, you have Laura Forlano, faculty member here at the Institute of Design. You also have Ruth Schmidt, which is here, and also another advisor. And we have also from the Stewart School of Business here at IIT, we have Smriti Anand, and both Laura and Smriti needed to be online for participating on that. So hi for the two of you that are on the streaming, and they will be participating online in our final conversation. So I want to also thank all of you that are here for the presentation and also online for the presentation. I want to thank our new dean, Anidjo Matthew, for the support for the PhD students, for the program, and of course for the faculty developing the research. So with much further ado, now I'm going to give that to Jessica and start the presentation. Thank you, Jessica.
Okay, how does this sound? Is that loud enough? Okay. All right, hi everyone. Thanks for coming in person and to see faces. It's very exciting. And I texted the link to my friends and family who are watching, and I'm sure they're gonna be like, what is Jessica gonna talk about for 45 minutes? So here we go. So the title of my talk and dissertation is Sensemaking for Power Asymmetries in Anti-Oppressive Design Practice. And so this thesis really began with my interest in how to shift those designers and design practice to design for more equitable solutions and outcomes. So really targeting those people that are like, we want to do this work, we know that our design solutions aren't where they need to be, but we lack the methods, we lack some of the information that we need to do this. So that's what motivated this. And I'm just outlining the talk. Basically, this is the structure of my thesis. So I'm just going to quickly go through the context and theory that I'm using and the methodology that's informing the experiments. And I'll spend more time on the experiments and the findings and implications at the end of the talk. And so So to start, I just want to start with the context, and I'm just labeling this session, Design-Mediated Technologies Create Asymmetries of Power. And before I just jump right into this, I just want to also point out, since the topic of my research is about racism and oppression, and a lot of the inequities facing society, I think it's especially important that I point out my own positionality as a researcher, as a white, cisgendered woman, working on this work, both in my research and at my job at Columbia College Chicago. For those of you that don't know, I'm co-director of academic DEI there as well. And so always in doing this work, I continually have to reflect on what we say in my household, the politics of me, so what it means to be me coming into a space to do this work, and how that might inform the questions I ask and the research findings that I make. And so that's just a continual process, and I'll circle back to that at the end in my implications. So just quickly, just to outline where I'm situating this work in the context of design and how design is connected to what I'm going to call information and communication technology. So it's much of the things we interact with on a daily basis, and I'll just abbreviate that as ICTs as we go along. And so the use of user-centered design and human-centered design methodologies have made so many of these technologies a ubiquitous part of our daily lives, shaped our daily interactions through graphical interfaces, user experience, navigation, communication, and marketing, among others. And I'm specifically looking at the dominant methodology of human-centered design, which we study many parts of here at ID, and how that is the main focus of design practice now, and how that interfaces with the development of ICTs. And so at the same time, we do know that these ICTs are driven by algorithmic computation. And there's a lot of bias that is now being surfaced. Many researchers, many activists, and people working on surfacing the bias that come as a result of this technology, machine learning. These are just a few headlines here of some of the issues that have just come up over the past, I want to say these are from just the past 3 years alone. So numerous researchers have documented examples of bias across sectors: healthcare access, education, hiring, criminal justice, media access, social government services, and facial recognition software. And so the bias that becomes embedded in these technologies contributes to further making distributions of these technologies and access to them more unequal. And so these are just some examples here of, like, interview software, Facebook, some facial recognition examples. In my research, we've looked at some emerging and now existing technologies of things like wireless shopping and the potential for bias in that. Again, the interview software, even things as simple as the like button are being called out for what potential bias and inequities those are creating. The Citizen app we've talked about, as well as the unintended consequences and racial profiling practices coming out of these technologies. And then furthering that, you have the corporate consolidation. You have capitalist neoliberal markets, it's like bouncing, increasing these inequities so that the distribution of the benefits of these are becoming fewer and more consolidated to those in power. So that's the context that I'm working in and looking at that. And again, thinking about what does this have to do with design? So I'll get to that in one second. You're like, why are we talking about technology? But the overall context I'm saying is that technological innovations in ICTs are driven by algorithmic solutionism that generate asymmetries of knowledge and information. So I'm really focusing on this idea of asymmetries. And then that asymmetry also creates asymmetries of power, which drive increasingly inequitable socioeconomic change. And so then back to design. As designers often, this is a sort of a strange place for me to take. I'm not fully in the technology development part of this, sort of looking at designers who are designing interfaces, interactions, service design, that are often sort of removed from the technological development. We don't necessarily have a say in how that algorithm is created or developed, but we're shaping interactions around that. And so human-centered design has really focused on how do we orient these interactions to the user? How do we serve the user's desires and needs, which then also creates profitability for businesses as well. If you continually serve the user and what they want, the idea is that you would generate more profit as well. And so then this has evolved into the packaging of this into design thinking that has been tried to be applied to a full range of management problems and innovation. And so while these things have definitely served to orient business thinking more towards the consumer, they still haven't prevented the problems that I've talked about before. Human-centered design, focusing on the human, is not preventing the bias that is deeply impacting the human. So there's a clear gap there. So my main argument is that I'm really focusing on the methods and methodologies of design. And again, also professional design practice. And so I'll talk a little bit about people operating outside of that, but that's really my focus now, is that those methods and methodologies fail to account for systemic oppression because of three main things. One, there's a neutral focus on the user. So they don't really, these methodologies just sort of say the user or the human and don't really consider that in systemic context or consider power relations around that. They're also material agnostic, meaning the whole idea of design thinking or something is that I can transport that from any sort of problem with any sort of material, not really accounting for the change in materiality, maybe changing the kinds of questions we need to ask. And then passive engagement specifically with these issues of inequity and bias. So there's sort of these general approaches, let's talk about these issues, let's talk about ethics, but they're not really getting specific about some of the issues that these methodologies are failing to prevent and sometimes contributing to. So therefore, my work in this project seeks to address these issues in these three ways. So addressing the neutral focus on the user, I'm saying that we need to have a socio-technical systems understanding of systemic context with a focus on power relations, so that's my hypothesis there. And then the second one, really focusing on understanding some more things about algorithmic materiality, that designers aren't fully considering or learning about just enough algorithmic materiality in order to think about designing interactions with and around that. And then a more explicit engagement with oppression, so specifically naming things like racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression are needed. But then the nature of my work is how do we do that in a way that can get people talking about it and move things forward. So just talking about oppression isn't necessarily going to move the needle there. And so I'll talk about how I frame this as a research question in just 1 second here, but I want to just point out before I move on what I'm referring to, because sometimes I've assumed this and I shouldn't, depending on the audience and their familiarity with this. But the definition of oppression that I'm working with is the systematic subjugation of one social group by a more powerful social group for the social, economic, and political benefit of the more powerful group. And then I'm also going to refer a lot to the term justice. And so I just want to be clear here, and I'm using Iris Marion Young's definition of justice, is that it's not just equal distribution of conditions or capacities or access to something, but it's also specifically referring to how constraints disable and how when certain conditions are present, things become less just. And I'll talk more specifically about what I mean by that. And so I'm going to move into the theory section here. So how do we address? I'm saying there's this gap, and what are my ideas about addressing that? How do we address that? So what I did was looked at the current state of the field of professional design, who's doing what, and then also what are some other theories that we might bring in that could really help designers think about this in new ways. And so participatory design, we have Amanda here, I'm always nervous to talk about participatory design because Amanda is our expert in this. But I just want to acknowledge there are definitely fields of design that for decades have been working on these issues of power relations and inequity. And participatory design has this intentional focus on power, ethics, and methods, and they include more voices in the design process, and so that can tend to equalize power as well, and seek to co-create with users and active participants. So definitely looking at the work being done in participatory design, but again, how do I pull that into professional design practice? Because the nature of participatory design is so much of this co-creation, which is labor intensive, it costs money, it often doesn't work well in market constraints. So looking to what we can pull in from that, but how do we make it work within professional practice. And very much related to that is value-sensitive design, which focuses on developing shared values across a range of stakeholders. And I just have this dotted line to just indicate that I think there's some really amazing work being done in value-sensitive design, and I've used some of their methods. They specifically focus on methods as well. But as it connects to my point about specifically naming racism and oppression and very specific outcomes of certain practices in design, there's some terms here that I find a little vague and difficult to work with when working on these issues, like value. That can be vague and malleable. Conflicting value requirements among stakeholders can be problematic as well, and then again, not specifically naming some of these issues. And value-sensitive design also, that people are definitely seeking to pull this into professional practice, but we don't quite have that evidence yet of what that means. And then lastly, as far as current approaches, ethics. So they're definitely designers, technologists, people working on ethical frameworks, trying to figure out how do we address these issues. But the main thing I focus on, is specifically as it relates to professional designers, is there's not a clear connection between some of these more broad ethical codes of conduct and practice. And so it's more abstract, it's reflective, but it doesn't necessarily say, like, when you're considering X, Y, or Z design decision, these are the things to think about. It's sort of the broad approach to ethics, like virtue ethics or things like that. And also, again, specific references to systemic oppression and unclear still how to proceed within market constraints. And so when I talk about widening the lens, a key thing I'm looking at is social justice work. I'm looking at feminist theory, critical race theory, many of these ideas are synthesized really well in the design justice network's work. Sasha Costanza-Chock here, who I've cited here, asks us to rethink design processes, center people who are normally marginalized by design, and use collaborative practices to co-create with people. But even as this is very new in the last few years, developing this network, which I'm a part of, but they even say we need methods. How do we do this now? We have these principles, but how do they become practice? And so calling on all of us to sort of test out things and try what will work, and especially what will work in a client situation. And another way that I'm pulling in from outside of design, science and technology studies definitely is related to design. This is very much influenced by my advisor, Laura Forlano. Definitely have a lot of tools for us, a way to look at this larger context of the socio-technical system and how these technologies aren't just about the phone and the app itself, but how that constellates a whole set of relations in society. And so designers need to think about all of that system there, not just the app itself. And so some of the ways that science and technology studies can help engaging with systemic context, exploring power relations between humans and non-humans, decentering the human, which seems like a bit of an oxymoron, like, hey, aren't we trying to consider people more? But some ways decentering in the part of the critique with human-centered design as well can maybe help us consider in the ways in which other actors and non-human things can determine power relations and flows. And then really looking at algorithmic materiality. And so I found this really great graphic, in the past week. You just never stop with this stuff. But this, I think, really tells us how science and technologies studies helps us consider what's called socio-technical matters. And so it's not just the black box of the algorithm itself, but who created it, how it was defined and constructed, how does it become enacted and socially contested in public, and then what are its effects on people and things. And then lastly, I'll just point out one other thing that's been very influential in the experiments I'll talk about is political economy, which seeks to consider social relations and particularly power relations. So it's not just looking at market power or economic resources, but the production, distribution, and consumption of a range of resources. And so this is a graphic I adapted that I found that it really also talks about asymmetries. So that's been very influential for me. So not just asymmetries of market power, but social power and political power. And so how all of the decisions that we make within a political economy, there's other relations and flows that are happening, not just monetary. And so the real question is, how do these theories and concepts get translated into methods and frameworks? So my research question is, how might professional design activities become embedded with concepts of justice and power in order to include information about systemic oppression? And then does that lead to consideration of more ethics and bias in the design of ICTs? And so the unit of analysis is really the salience of these concepts in problem framing activities in design. So how much in the experiments that I'm doing do these issues come up? Does it help designers think about these issues differently? And then further down the line, make different design decisions. And so just very briefly, the methodology that I'm using is really focusing on problem making and sense making and research through design. And those of you that know me, I always have a joke or two. I couldn't help myself. This is really for my parents, my undergraduate degree is in film. So this is Hitchcock, and my film history professor was really into Hitchcock. So this is Hitchcock doing problem framing. So it's still with me. But really focusing on problem framing as a key skill of design, the co-evolution of the design problem through iterative problem framing, and how design can help us reframe some of these issues and ask different questions and hopefully lead to maybe different kinds of solutions. And then research through design. And so this is, for those that may not know, what we really focus on in our program here at ID. How do we use design methods and artifacts in order to generate new knowledge, as opposed to like a scientific method or something like that. So using different design experiments to generate knowledge. And so basically I'm going to talk about 4 different experiments. The first one will be this justice lenses, which really focuses on that explicit engagement with oppression. Then case study analyses, I'll talk about those really briefly. That hits on both systemic context and power relations and algorithmic materiality. And then the final 2 I'll spend a little bit more time on, critical visualizations and participatory workshops, which are very clearly research through design activities, hit on all 3. So this is the experiments here. So again, my hypothesis is, how do we use existing professional methodologies to evolve the design capability of problem framing and sense making in order to make these ideas more salient for designers? And so justice lenses, the sub-research question, as I'm really looking at what is a common discourse about ethics and justice that might lead to explicit engagement with systemic oppression and can be shared and understood across a diverse range of professional designers. And so this is also really informed by my lived experience in my own job, in the work that my co-director, Raquel Monroe, who I think is watching as well, and I do in working on academic diversity, equity, and inclusion at Columbia, is understanding that not everyone finds explicit engagement with racism super accessible right away. And so what are some other concepts and ways to get into these issues that can be helpful for designers at the level of design practice? So not to say that we shouldn't all be doing that own personal work and individual work to understand these issues as well, but then once it comes down to the nuts and bolts and moving papers around and creating new policies, what are some other ways we can talk about this? And so this is just here, what I've done is I synthesized a bunch of different research, like justice philosophers, feminist philosophers, and then design justice people as well, and created these different, what I'm just calling lenses, for lack of a better term, of ways to think about qualities of justice. And so how accessible is something? How affordable is it? How transparent is it? Does it offer somebody agency or empowerment? And then you can see I've sort of mapped it out, like there's this justice considerations across the top, and then I've also overlaid it onto the design process just as an experiment. I didn't end up using that throughout everything, but it really kind of helped think about mapping it onto the design process, a couple key things instead of the usual empathize that we talk about in design. I sort of played around with this word recognize, so recognizing context and autonomy and well-being as these overarching frames, and then again this idea of problem framing there. So we ended up using these in subsequent experiments, and I think people found it pretty accessible and as a way to think about some of these concepts. So this is just a screenshot. A lot of since it was pandemic, the workshops that we did were on Miro, on the Miro whiteboard, and then on Zoom. And so this is just a screenshot of Miro and how people were able to use some of these qualities, and I'll show you in a little bit about how they did that. And so then the next one is case study analyses. And so what I did here was I wanted to understand some of these issues of bias in ICTs and put this socio-technical lens on it. And so this idea of an assemblage, like that there's a technology is operating in context of all of these different relations. And I chose I tried to choose 3 different things where, first of all, there was a lot written about it, so I could study it and map it, think about all the different agents within those technologies, and then also trying to get some things from different sectors. And so anything with a case study analysis, like once we start using some of this theory and overlay it onto these cases, how do they become transferable between each of them? So there's a case of a biased health risk prediction algorithm that I'll talk about more. And then the 2 others that we did were, and I say we because I had research assistants throughout. Julia Rockland's in here and Zia Chen is in here. And then also McKinley Sherrod and Audrey Gordon also helped me with this so much. So we also looked at the Facebook like button and financial app for teens called MoneyThink, which is a really great article analyzing that, and there's a lot of IDEO worked on that as well, so there's a lot of information there. So my sub-research question for this is, how does bias become embedded and emergent in ICTs through choices in materiality, construction, and design? And so I ended up focusing very much on this bias in this risk prediction algorithm. There's an extensive article, researchers looked into this and simulated the algorithm, which basically served, it turns out it under-identified Black patients because they made a couple key assumptions. They made an assumption, and again, they're trying to predict risk, like who in the future do we maybe need to target that are at high risk for health issues and high risk for health costs for a medical system or something like that. And they made an assumption that past health costs would equal future health costs. So that's how we set up the algorithm. And then they also stripped out any racial identifying data in an attempt to be quote unquote colorblind. And so that actually strips out a lot of systemic context because past health care costs for Black patients are going to be lower for a whole other reasons of social and systemic inequities, such as access to healthcare, trust to healthcare, lack of insurance, and a whole lot of other things. So not only is that correlation problematic, but then to strip out any racial identifying information further prevents you from accounting for some of these things. And so the good news is that the researchers found this. They contact the provider company named Optum, and then they fixed it. So it's a good example of academia does matter in researching that, but that the company itself wouldn't have done that otherwise. And so through these case studies, developed this, what I call like errors, and they're like, I call them errors of oppression, or these biases that happen in the development of ICTs. And I'm not gonna spend too much time on this, but I just wanted to show you we also work with these in the workshops as well. You can see Miro does that thing where it just puts text on a different line. As a graphic designer, it's hard. But I just talked about an error like correlation. They made a correlation in the programming. So these are ways to think about what happens in the development of the black box that a designer may not have a say in, but they might be able to question later, like having that awareness of how these things get created. But what I did do, I'll spend more time on this, critical visualizations. And this is my own sort of term, and I'm trying to map out this case study and really think about what are the ways to make this salient for designers that they can engage with and really emphasize these ideas of flows of power and how things become more inequitable within a system. So how might designers better understand systemic context and power relations, algorithmic materiality, and structural oppression through the research through design method of visualization and mapping? And so mapping is commonly used in design, as we know. We have many experts in here. Tomoko's in here as well, which I'm like nervous about showing my maps a little bit, but commonly used. So the idea of like, this is something that designers are familiar with. What if we mapped in a different way? And I have a little shout out to 101 design methods there as well. So we're all familiar with mapping in some way, system mapping. So how can we explore that? And then I looked a lot at critical cartography. In ways that people use the map as a political tool and a way to investigate things that perhaps are not equitable, perhaps are hidden or outside the norm of what we normally consider normative or on a map. And so tools that I'm thinking about moving through this are what scale do I want to use, what orientation, what framing and organization of the things on the maps do I want to use. And then also I'm thinking about, again, this concept of a socio-technical assemblage. So thinking about this algorithm itself that's biased, but then all the other things, how that operates within a system, how people experience it, the functions and features of technology itself, and then societal implications as well. And so I used this case study. I just wanted to throw that up there again. And this is, there were 3 iterations. So we went through 3 different versions of this, and they're all quite different. And this is the final one. And again, Julia found this amazing, it's called an angry map in the book Diagrams of Power, that really had this concept of gears in here. If you can kind of, hopefully that comes across, where there's these gears of systems turning things. And so we ran with that. And then what I did, and I'll have some close-ups here, is I really made very specific choices. This is not a standard map. It's a map intended to communicate the ideas that I think are most important in these concepts, and very specifically to communicate what we normally don't map. So on this dotted line here, oh, it's attached to me, I can move. It says the boundary of most stakeholder models. So designers were very familiar with mapping, but I'm indicating that that is actually quite a small range of this map. This is the black box here, and these red spots are what I call bias hotspots, areas that there's a special conditions are ripe for bias to emerge or occur. And so you can see, like the algorithm, I have one there. But I also have one over here around the user. And let me just zoom in here. So this is what I've mapped here. The key things I'll also point out are inequities and equities, and then the systems, technologies, and constructs. And again, this is really trying to map theory. So it was a thing to wrestle with. But in showing this to different designers, people have become very interested in this. Like, how did you do that? And really wanting to study as a way to think about the concepts in any given context. If we visualize it, what new knowledge might that lead to? So you can see I have this whole construct here, this circle, structural oppression, and it has these inequities on here. Things like lack of insurance, lack of employment, things that actually exist continually. Like once you do this, you're like, set, I'm all right. Here, I get my structural oppression circle, and we can apply it to pretty much everything. And then I have these flows of what I call logics. And so there's logics of policy making, service to client, and it's actually a pretty dense map. For those of you that aren't used to this, when you first see these, when you get to ID, you're like, what am I supposed to, it's meant to be read, it takes a while. So I'm just going through it quickly here. I already showed this here. You can see I have some technology components in the black box, as well as a way to visualize what are the things we don't necessarily know about and might need to consider. You can see the logics of profit there. And then I have I threw some different design interventions on there as well. So there's like a diabetes care app, let's say, and a clinic or service design. So the different ways that design might come into this, and then all the other human and non-human agents involved. And so that informed what we then did in the participatory workshops, and then Zia Chen is here, who helped me so much with this. And so we did a series of workshops with professional designers. So these are people that are, again, wanting to engage in this. Online workshops, I think 3 or 4. This is like the larger research question then, back to this. So how do we embed these ideas? This is just a screenshot from some of the workshops. And we reverse engineered an IDEO case study on their website, just because this is a very classic example of well-known firm using human-centered design. A case that they have on their site about a diabetes app that they created. The client was Essentia, which does those Contour 1 meters to test blood sugar. And I just wanted to point out when they talk about this, these are some of the issues that people have with empathy and human-centered design. To generate empathy as well as build the app's initial data sets, the scientists wore it themselves, and they track their blood sugar around the office. So these are the kinds of criticisms that people are definitely putting on human-centered design. Like, that doesn't necessarily generate empathy or knowledge about the user. To simulate something, like the worst case scenario of this is when people like blindfold themselves or something to simulate what someone without sight might feel like. So this is still very present in the industry. Oh, and this is just their final kit. And so they really tout that the 50 people they tested this with helped improve their blood sugar and their overall well-being. All of this ignores the actual context of diabetes in the United States, which are very much distributed among racial lines, like who is most impacted. So this is just a chart you can see very quickly. White, non-Hispanic people, 7%, black, 12%, American Indian, Alaska Native, 15% with diabetes. And this is about 10 years old, but the stats are, I think, pretty similar, but the overall numbers of people with diabetes are increasing. And then it also goes, it's unequal along education lines as well. So I chose this, like this idea that like this app's going to solve all the problems with diabetes, sort of techno-solutionist idea. And so we reverse engineered this as maybe thinking, maybe this isn't the best solution for this problem. And so this is the brief that we gave participants. Did a Google search, typical persona. So I'm just trying to point out problems with standard design tools. I didn't make this is just out there. So we used the persona of Linda. And then we introduced specific asymmetries. You can see we just started with a few, like knowledge, information, and power, and asked people to come up with some others. And then I gave them the prompts of those systemic inequities that came out through the mapping process. And also the justice qualities. And also the biases. We didn't quite get to everything. But you can, this is just a shot of, we did a power analysis, what we call the descriptive power web, which is a play on the descriptive value web. And really asking where the user is, which we think of the user is the center, but actually the user may not have very much power in this particular case. Linda might not have as much power as many other people and constructs and systems in this. So this is one example of a group's diagram here. And a close-up of that, and you can see they moved around some of the justice qualities, and they created their own as well. And then we also worked with scenarios as a way to think about what IDEO said was what happened with their app. And then I gave them these systemic inequities, and we created a noir scenario, which comes out of value-sensitive design as well. And you can see people starting to overlay some of those systemic inequities onto this traditional scenario, like things we're not considering in this more positive version of what this app would do for people. And I just had to show, because Zia and I spent so much time on coding these. So these, we coded, I did interviews with the participants, and we coded all of the Zoom recordings of everything. And just you don't need to look at all of this, but just very quickly, you can see that we ended up talking a lot about power and privilege. And then also subsequently in the interviews, I just want to point out, we talked a lot about organizational resistance in people's own firms, and organizational change emerged as a big theme. And so after going through all these experiments, I just revised the hypothesis a bit to be more clear about when I'm talking about systemic context and power relations, focusing on asymmetries, logics, and flows of power, algorithmic materiality, understanding potential for bias, and then explicit engagement with oppression by specifically orienting to those qualities of justice. And then also another thing to point out is I generated this list of contextually rich design methods. So things that I'm saying that designers are familiar with now, again, because of the urgency of this problem, how do we meet designers where they are, but then infuse these ideas with it. And the things that are in bold are things that we actually worked with in these projects, but there are many others in the future. And so all of this resulted in this anti-oppressive design framework. And I want to give another shout out To Hillary Carey, PhD student at Carnegie Mellon, who's watching now as well, to kind of help me think through and talk through this as well. So this is really just a conceptual model to connect these theories to professional practice to help designers take action in their daily design work. And the main things, I didn't want to create some new methodology or things like that. I just wanted to create a way for designers to kind of enter into wherever they get called in to do a project. We all know we don't all get called in at the front end of a design problem. But we can move into this and think about, well, if I'm at this stage of the process, these are some things I may consider. I wanted it to be very tangible and adaptable. There's no hierarchy here. And any firm could come in and change this to adapt to their own process. And so it's organized around these 5 areas of activity, and I'll walk through those here. So Sensemaking, develop an orientation toward power asymmetries by centering inequities, which is exactly what I did with that mapping, and really making that clear, like starting each project, like what are some of these things that we need to consider, and identifying the logics of the system. And one way I often think about logics is, you know, what does the organization want? What is it naturally going to do? What is the logic of this company? And consider that as we design something, that there may be some resistance or something there. And so, as I said, this is the centering of inequities and logics. I did that through mapping, but there are definitely other ways that that could be done. And just some key findings from the research, from the workshops and everything else, is that foregrounding power, as you saw in the coding, definitely increased the salience of power asymmetries. So having these conversations, doing the power web, definitely encourage people to talk about it, consider new issues, consider new questions they might ask in that problem framing end of the process. But then also that working with power is difficult. So someone in an interview afterwards said power is a hard one. Because, you know, what do we mean? Power over, power to. We're not necessarily trying to equalize power. Like, just because I say asymmetry doesn't mean we mean symmetry. So there's still, like, some fuzziness there, but I think that's sort of the power of this. Pun. That's sort of the way in which this could work, is that people having these discussions might surface a lot of these issues about, am I giving the user more or less agency or power? Meaning making is the second part of this, taking responsibility for how our own position as designers determines our politics and power. And so questioning methodologies, which you saw, you know, earlier, I'm questioning human-centered design, and then contextualizing the methods that we use. And so again, persona, I'm not the first to critique personas and how effective they may or may not be as a tool, but I think one of the main issues is that they are not in context. Like, Linda is not in any sort of systemic context. It's just very much about her personal motivations and frustrations. And so any of the methods that we might use, like, are they fully taking into account systemic context? And so one of the key findings, challenge how we understand the user through systemic context. So in a sort of an interesting way, by focusing on this larger big picture in the workshops, people actually considered the user in a more direct and specific way, in a way that I don't think they would have, that we don't think they would have had they just focused on the user right to start with. So it's not to say we're not post-human and not forgetting the human or anything like that that people sort of worry about, but this gives some other sort of perspective on it. And then the other key point I want to make, especially with the participants that we're working very closely with technology developers, they're still quite removed in some cases from the human. And so this idea that, like, we should just get rid of the human, and so this is my second joke, even though I've made other jokes. That's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, which turns out is like an old German phrase. It's really true. So I'm saying we shouldn't throw out human-centered design, that actually we still need to consider that, and it's actually sorely missing from a lot of this development. But that we need to consider more than one methodology and understand the limitations of that. And choice making, this is really getting down to the nuts and bolts of making design decisions, and I'm pulling a lot from Jenny Davis's work in How Artifacts Afford, where she's specifically trying to operationalize the idea of affordances. And she talks about mechanisms of affordance and conditions of affordance, which to me really, I think, get at that tangible level for designers. Does this choice in my interface design encourage action, discourage? Does it refuse it? How easy is it for the user to do something? And to me, a classic example is these cookies notices where I just hit OK, 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 which is actually not what I want to do, but it's definitely discouraging me from action in the way that it's designed. And another thing that emerged, a finding that emerged through the experiments that I'm sort of embedding in here, is that there are points of agency within the design process. And so I'm not saying, like, you know, there's some people, like, I like the phrase trickster or things like, there's different people that are approaching this in different ways. I'm not saying to necessarily be subversive, but to understand simple decisions can give a user more or less agency and perhaps, or help us identify if bias is happening or not. So there are points of agency at any point in the design process, and to look at the existing structures that we have to identify what those moments might be. And then value making. I'm saying value making for power flow disruption. So this is really at the level of like, okay, these biases are occurring. We need to redirect. We need to change this. We need to challenge this in whatever is starting to become enacted in the design. And so that's, for me, like this part of this experiment was looking at these bias hotspots, areas where we know we might need to be especially aware for potential for bias. And a key finding out of these was using applied examples really helped. That people are desperate for that in doing this work. Like, they really like to be able to work with that actual brief and an actual case as a way to tackle this, as opposed to sort of abstract notions. And then related to that, that ethics are not enough. That's why they want the applied example. Like, okay, what exactly are we talking about? Let's get this down to the level of design decision making and problem framing. And then finally, impact making. Determine the accountability for power distribution. And so this is where I'm saying, like, prioritizing justice, countering oppression, really sort of the larger overall goals of a project, which again, I realize that the reason that I want this to be adaptable, not everybody has that ability in their specific work contexts. And so then that's the justice qualities. So like if we can even just simply prioritize some of these in a given project. Finding out of here is knowing what you know and what you don't know. And so in working with fellow stakeholders, being aware if you are or not aware of some of the issues around these things, and having that self-reflexivity to know that, and that what other people might not know is a key point in this. So this idea of constant learning. And then rethinking design expertise and know-how, and I'll come back to this at the end here. So overall, oops, forgot a little quote there, painful. I'm calling this a discursive boundary object, meaning this is a framework that serves to align different stakeholders around something to develop sort of a shared understanding through conversation. So through conversations about power, so much of the workshops and the findings are people like, this is a great way to talk about this. I thought about issues in a different way. I want to take this back to my organization, but I need to adapt it to the way we do things. So just starting these conversations and having this design tool in order to do that. So just to conclude, the implications, I just have 4 key points here. I finish by talking about the need for a critically informed design praxis in order to do this. So how do you bring theory into practice? And so I'm pulling here from Yamamoto's critical race praxis with these 4 components of conceptual, performative, material, and reflexive. So conceptual is like the theory that's informing the work, and so you saw what's informing mine. Performative, the action, the who and the what are we actually doing, which is so key for design. The material, which are the outcomes. And then reflexive, so again, this idea like, okay, I'm going to continually reflect back what works, what didn't, and build theory from further action. And so I mentioned rethinking design knowledge. So I think overall we really need to start pushing back on how design knowledge is created and legitimated, and like that these ideas must account for design knowledge. Considering non-Western, non-colonial, and non-white epistemologies, considering people's lived experiences, there's so many other things we can draw upon other than what we normally think of as standard design knowledge. Decentering our own expertise within a community of practice, and again, that's that self-awareness and being willing to learn. and embrace iterative learning by doing, which as designers, for those of you that are designers, I think that's what we do. And so it's just a matter of doing it. I think with these kinds of issues and working with these concepts, people are often afraid to engage, but that is the only way to actually learn. And then I also think that there's a real potential for design to contribute, and I'm not saying like design will save the world, but that design activities can help surface and differentiate a lot of these issues in justice-oriented design, and we can leverage our skills in sense-making in order to do this. And then finally, really connecting back to like don't throw the baby out with the bathwater is really just embracing more hybrid methodologies. And I'm saying with a pluriversal, epistemologically diverse mindset. So like, when do I want to pull in different kinds of ideas to do what kind of work in any given project as being appropriate, rather than just touting, we follow this rigid system. And so I just finished with I almost finished on this image of, I just love this, like, make Earth cool again. The planet is changing, why aren't we? Just thinking about the climate report that came out this week, and the often quoted definition, Herbert, I think it's Simon's definition, design is about changing existing situations into preferred ones. And so I finished the dissertation just talking about the responsibility of design, but hopefully really putting it in the context of that this is a long game. So again, back to my own job and my work. Rocky and Danielle, who are on the call, we were getting really discouraged by some people standing in our way of our anti-racist work at our own institution. And one of our advisors, the facilitator that walks us through a lot of these things, he said, it's a long game, keep your eyes on the prize. And so I just keep thinking about that, like it's just these small steps and that so many people are afraid to move forward with it, but hopefully some little things of this can contribute to knowledge in design and help people start to move some things forward. So make Earth cool again, I'll finish with that. Thanks, that's it. Oh, I thought I had the title slide there, but I don't.
We have 2 minutes that we can open for discussion. So if we have comments, if we have questions, and engage in a conversation with Jessica, that's the one.
Amanda.
Can you go back a few slides to Linda? I'm curious.
To Linda. Oh, Linda.
So you had like in the workshop that people were using, like that Linda was, go to that slide where Linda's there and
Oh, yeah.
around Linda.
Oh, that was back at the workshops, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So when you started the workshops, I'm just curious, like how was it Linda introduced? Like what was introduced in terms of information to your participants in these workshops? Like did they see the data about diabetes, that kind of thing? Like what was the context of the experiment in this exercise?
The context was we just started with the brief and the persona. And later, we introduced more data about diabetes, but that was not introduced there. So actually, and so I'm now jumping ahead to your point, people actually very quickly realized, given these other prompts, that brief and everything was not considering a lot of other things. So it was really just the brief and that. And so it was just a simple stakeholder map, but with, again, these other kinds of prompts. Yeah. So if I look back at, I think I showed it.
The prompts being the lens.
Yeah, the lenses and the asymmetries and the biases, the justice qualities. And then on this, you can see like, we started with some organizations, some constructs, relationships, and then we also put the asymmetries there. So it wasn't like a neutral power map, but it was just saying like, okay, this is what we understand to be the normal or the normative context. There.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
Anita.
So fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
Very well done. I'm also happy that you're critiquing traditional design methods. I'm curious why you decided to make it a discursive boundary object rather than a design method. Because here you're using it as a design method, and you're expecting people to use it as a design method, but I think you stop one step before that.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. I guess suppose so. Yes. I guess because I was really pulling back to this framework itself. So versus I don't see this as and again, we debate the word framework, right? We're like, is there some other word I could use? But I don't see this as a method, whereas like the descriptive power web was a method. So I think that's how I was conceiving of it. Like this is this larger thing that we could pull people in and out of. But to your point, yeah. I think maybe I'm also just kept trying to do the boundary object thing, and it's always like,
so the way I propose thinking about PhDs to students,
mm-hmm.
we have this conversation as faculty, is not that it's PhD dissertation is not the end of the journey, right? It's the beginning of the journey.
Yeah.
You're just positioning, putting a stake in the ground and saying, this is the kind of work that I'm interested in. So it can very well lead to something in the future. But I think that if we, as designers, stop short of providing methods, our value to the world is also not complete.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, I think that when we say that something is wrong, and here's why it's wrong, and that's it,
Mm-hmm.
then people are like, okay, so what's next?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, so that seems like a trailer to a film, but you never showed me the film.
Well, so I think you like certain kinds of films, though, then, too, right?
Which is fair, right? But see, the thing is, when my former advisor would say, if you start running, I can tell you that you're running in the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're not running, then I don't know what to say.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like this, and you've done a great job, and I'm not saying that the dissertation any best. I feel like you could convert this.
Well, and so I think what I moved it back to this because one of the next steps I really want to do, and I said this, I got feedback from designers, how did you do that? And I just submitted a paper this week that got a nasty review back. It's always nice, right, the day before your dissertation. But I understood the gist of it because in the paper I was talking about this mapping process, which I very clearly described the process, but I sort of promised that I would then help people to do it. And I haven't gotten there yet. And to me, that's what I want. That's one of the things I really want to work on next is how would I teach diagrams of power? How would I walk people through that and in their own work? So that's the other thing too. Like I've been kind of in this space, but what if we moved into another, a firm and said, what's your process? How would you think about a context of this new project you've got coming in? How could I walk you through this and let's co-create that together? So I hear you, and I'm like, I don't have time. But yeah, that's one of the things for sure that I want to work on.
I think you actually started to talk about that when you showed your framework. I mean, frameworks are a lens to see the world, right? When you talked about like how can people use this when, which type of I can't remember what you were talking, approaches,
Yeah.
sub-lenses to use when. So that's a beginning of a method. And I think what some of the shortfalls of a method is that it's too generic, right? It's not contextualized to meet the needs of the situation. But I think what you're providing is a way to get to how to tailor the method for the situation that somebody might find themselves in. So I think you have a beginning, you're using this as a way to allow people to make their own methods in a way.
Yeah.
Through the project. And I think that diagramming, the methodology of diagramming them in with that, right? That's a different kind of method that includes these things, right? But so when we talk about methods, I think we have to talk about methods of what? Is it a method of using the framework? Is it a method of elucidating and illuminating the issues that are there? Like there's different kinds of methods, different kinds of problems. But I think you started to talk about that.
That helps me. I appreciate that framing because that was the original intention. In March of 2020, I was 2 days from going to New York to work with a firm that really would have like taken some of these ideas and said, I think to what you're speaking to, okay, I'm thinking we need to center inequities. How would that work in your processes? But yeah, you're helping me think about the next level articulation of what you would then do with this thing. So same.
Yeah, but also as an educator, you have the opportunity and the support to work with new actors in the field, right? Like students
Yeah.
are going to take positions of power eventually, and teach them that these are things that you need to be concerned about. And I think that's where the power of an educator is, right? So we may not change the world from our small method that we create, but the impact of that, the ripple effect of that, of people using it in their work, in their leadership positions, in the government role that they have, can be massive.
I have another meeting.
Okay, thank you so
And I
much.
look forward to reading your dissertation.
Thank you. Wow. Words not often spoken. Thank you. Amanda.
So I guess, we defined a lot of terms, which I appreciate, because like in public health and my other disciplines, definitions are really important to give us a way to kind of have a party conversation. But I guess I was kind of intrigued by the notion of professional design articulated, and when you're
Oh,
talking
yeah.
about firms,
Yeah.
I'm also wondering what kind of firms, because like even in some LinkedIn thing yesterday, where I was pointing to this list, and there was a whole discussion about this whole catalog of firms who are out there now. I forget what the name of that was.
Yeah, I think it's social design list. Yeah.
And so like even when you're talking about firms, I'm like what firms? Like at some point systems are broken. So I go to firms who are driven by certain values. Like when you say firms, like what firms and why? Why go to a firm? And is there a situation that you can think about professional practice outside of existing firms? So I'm just like, how would you unpack professional design?
No, that's a great point. No, so it was very specifically in response to specific people that it was like the George Eyes of the world, and then like Irem brought in Rob Gerling from Artifact Group, and the firm I was going to start to work with was ThoughtWorks, and so people that are definitely making some claims, but clearly work for profit, and so like Greater Good Studio and some of those companies are starting, organizations, I think are definitely starting to move, like we're not even going to take certain clients, we're not going to do this kind of thing. I did put a flag right before that, I think, for this particular work, trying to give people, I feel like there's power in that lane to give those people the tools. That said, this is a conversation that Chris and I have all the time as well, just overthrow the whole system because we know it's messed up. But at this moment, I do think even small changes in the things that we're designing can have a big impact. So that it is a,
I understand.
yeah. But you're right. I should just define it a little more.
Well, and also, I just wonder, like, for instance, it also is a specific kind of practice, right? So
Yeah.
versus somebody like me who's in-house, right? So you have a long conversation with an organization, which is its own set of
Yes.
constraints and freedoms. And so, like, I think that's interesting, too, like, people who are doing client-facing work versus people who are working in institutions. So I wonder how this kind of approach would, like, function in those,
Ab-
get more traction in-house.
And that emerged in the interviews after the workshops too, because there were definitely a couple people that had very different in-house experiences, but they were out there looking, okay, this is what people are doing, how do I bring this back? So like one of the key things I end up talking about a lot is, I think what's frustrating about us as designers, we go in, here's your workshop, bye, here's your framework, but there's still a lot of work to figure out how to translate this for that person's context.
It's like educating somebody on how to do an interview with open-ended questions. Like, for instance, students, when they come back, well, we did a survey, like, we got the answers. Like, that wasn't how this is supposed to work. So
Right.
that's the other thing about how you use a thing.
Right, and so I think that speaks to what Tomoko was saying as well. It's like, how do you translate? Like, there were definitely people I want to follow up with more. They're saying this doesn't work. I can't go in and say this, but I can talk about this. So I'm thinking about this in my own work. Colby.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to thank you for that great presentation. I particularly feel myself about to become a very long process of angry math, and I appreciated the whole construct and the hotspot thing also feels was really impactful to me. And there's one other thing I wanted to compliment you on, but I can't remember.
There's plenty of time.
I know what it was. The decentering the humans,
Oh.
recenter
Well, the short answer is no. But no, but now I'm like, did we get that recorded? Did that pick up? Because I love all of those questions. But I'm thinking as you asked, there were definitely, I think about that in terms of what we do as designers. Like there are definitely moments where you have to backtrack and say, why did we do that? Like, we all do this. I'm gonna move it there, and like, you know, and so that's like why we do think aloud protocols to figure out why did you do that. And there were participants for sure that I think there was a really right moment and other things to mind about how they we gave them just like a simple stakeholder, like a bullseye map, like very simple outlines. And some people were very put off by that. We can't do that. I have to get rid of the circles. Do we have, you know, and like, but it was like, I don't want to say it wasn't discursive though. Like there was something about it that they had to move, and there were definitely other approaches that were felt approaches. Like there was one group, I need to put a giant pink blanket over everything. That's capitalism. So there were these other things that we didn't necessarily articulate, but they were quick and sparked some other subsequent changes in their diagrams. But I'll definitely, I'm very fascinated with all the things you just asked. And that definitely this idea of switching the scale and adding friction in the process too, as to where that could happen. I think those are great. We got it on video. Yeah, thank you. Carlos.
Just like you to expand a little bit on commenting. We have been discussing methods, tools, scale, timing. This looks to me a lot of the process of designing, and we are looking at this material as potentially being like a process, a tool, a framework. But I'd like you to talk a little bit about the point of view of how you work with that as lenses. Because I think lenses are very different from methods, tools, because it's almost like giving people glasses or a microscope. And what happens to look at the process, look at the tool, look at the making with new, a new perspective. So how do you talk about this as a lenses rather than the repertoire of practice that we have been using? Like how do you add a point of view to the practice? If you could expand a little bit more on that.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking about the depth, the choice, again, in those two different terms. So like, I'm comparing like what I kept calling just as lenses, which you can see I switched to qualities in the workshops. I think partly to sort of skirt the question you're asking, but I not necessarily only for the purpose of the workshop. But then this idea of centering those inequities. So I do think there's a difference in using an inequity as a lens, depending on what you're doing. There's definitely certain contexts and projects where that's your whole focus is one of those things. But I like the way that you're sort of circling back to this, like that seeing through these ideas into every project, I do think is more actionable. That's how I would put that a little bit differently. Like even to me, a lot of these are very easy to understand how they might become manifest in a design solution. And so to always be like that, to me, that's also a lens, is to always be thinking about, like if it's just how you're understanding the world versus a process or a framework, like at this stage, I will now be thinking about X, Y, or Z. Then again, centering inequities, you're always thinking about it, but that's very clearly in the problem framing in this particular approach. So yeah, all the things, I'm like, oh yeah, I didn't fully articulate that either. Okay. But yeah, I do see that that's still the appropriate term for that.
Final question or comment? So once again,
Thank
you.
you.
Very much.
I'm going to take this off now. Bye, everyone.
So we close here the public presentation on the oral defense, and we now are gonna get into a close conversation with Jessica, and then conclude this process of the final defense. So thank you all for participating on the streaming, and thank you all for coming here. And we consider that closed. Thank you.